Hi everybody, my name is Pushpendra and welcome to the Voice Wallet. So in today's episode, we are going to be discussing the economic crisis and the reforms of year 1991, the time when India's economy was struggling hard to survive from the balance of payment crisis, the time when the inflation in the economy had reached to the level of 13% and the fiscal deficit had reached to the level of 8.4% of the GDP, and India's forex reserve had fallen below $1 billion, which is going to be barely enough to cover 1 or 2 weeks of the import, which left the country on the edge of bankruptcy. So in this video, I'm going to be cover what were the reasons which led to the crisis of 1991 and the impacts of those reform on the economy post economic crisis. So please watch this video till the end and let me know in the comments that what the lesson you learned from this story. So the story is going to be begin in 1980s, जहां इंडिया की इकोनॉमी स्टिल एक हैविली रेगुलेटेड और कंट्रोल इकोनॉमी थी और गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया उस टाइम पे डिसाइड करती थी कि क्या प्रोड्यूस करना है, कितना प्रोड्यूस करना है और कौन प्रोड्यूस करेगा। और द पब्लिक सेक्टर यूनिट्स जो डोमिनेट करती थी सेक्टर्स और इंडस्ट्रीज लाइक स्टील, कोल और एनर्जी, एंड वाइल प्राइवेट प्लेयर्स जो थे वो ऑपरेट करते थे अंडर स्ट्रिक्ट रिस्ट्रिक्शंस और रेगुलेशन, विच इज गोइंग टू बी ऑफन कॉल्ड एज लाइसेंस राज। बट द प्रॉब्लम वाज दैट गवर्नमेंट वाज स्पेंडिंग मोर देन its earnings, and throughout the 1980s India's fiscal deficit kept rising and reached to the level of 8.4% of the GDP. And a large chunk of the budget went to the subsidies, defense, or to the inefficient public sector units. And these PSUs, instead of generating profit, had become burden to the Indian economy and draining government's budget year after year. And to finance the rising expenditure, government kept borrowing both domestically and internationally. And due to this, slowly debt piled up and interest payment started consuming a large part of the government revenue. And this was the beginning of the vicious cycle where first to borrow to spend and then again borrow to repay the previous loan. And at the same time, inflation was kept rising steadily and the prices of the good were rising, and which reduced the purchasing power of the ordinary man. And by the time of the crisis, inflation had touched to the almost 13%. And to make the thing more worse, India's export were not rising as required, and country is going to be heavily dependent on the imports, especially crude oil, fertilizers or the machinery. And as a result, India's current account deficit had reached to the level of 3% of the GDP by 1991. And now let's add some political instability to this already fragile economic situation, where in 1989 Rajiv Gandhi governments failed and then Janata Dal coalition came to the power, which collapsed soon after, followed by Chandrasekhar's short-lived government. And due to this frequent changes in the political leadership, there was no constant economic policy or the no long-term planning, which reduced the confidence among investors or the international lenders. And also in 1990 August came the Gulf War when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And due to this, globally crude oil prices shot up dramatically, and for India, which is going to be importing at that time 70% of its oil requirement, the import bill was going to be double within the months. And at the same time, another external shock hit the India, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, where the USSR had been one of the India's largest trading partner under a special rupee-ruble trade agreement. When the Soviet Union broke apart, the trade system collapsed and reducing India's export further. And by this point of time, international communities has lost confidence in India's ability to repay its loan, and credit rating agency also downgraded India's credit worthiness, making it even harder to borrow the loan. And by now, India's economy was in complete crisis. Inflation in the economy was 13% and the fiscal deficit was 8.4% of the GDP. And India's forex reserve started collapsing and were down to the less than $1 billion, which is going to be barely enough to cover 1 or 2 weeks of the import, which left India just few weeks away from the bankruptcy. And to avoid the sovereign default, India pledged 67 tons of the gold to the IMF for the emergency bailout. And this step of the government signaling the severity of the crisis and urgent need of the structural economic reforms. But as they say, every crisis creates an opportunity. So by the time in June 1991, PV Narasimha Rao became the Prime Minister of India, and he appointed Dr. Manmohan Singh as a Finance Minister. And they together decided that simply addressing the crisis was not enough. India needed a complete structural economic reforms. And that was the time when they introduced LPG reforms, which aims to rescue India from the severe balance of payment crisis and modernize its outdated, tightly controlled economy. And the reforms fundamentally shifted India's economic policy from socialist government dominated model to globally integrated system. And these reforms are divided into three major pillars: liberalization, privatization, and globalization, where each of them was addressing the different aspect of the economy. And the liberalization was first and the most crucial step, designed to free Indian economy from the decades of excessive government control and regulation, often referred as license raj. And the liberalization policy removed the industrial licensing requirement for most of the sector except a few strategic areas like defense and the atomic energy. And liberalization also reduced import tariffs, simplified tax structures, and deregulate market prices, and allowing the market to determine them. And the banking and the financial sectors also reformed to improve the transparency and efficiency. And while FDI was encouraged to bring new technology, capital, and managerial expertise, and as a result, Indian entrepreneurs gained the confidence to operate and compete without unnecessary bureaucratic barriers. And the privatization was the second pillar, which aimed to reduce the dominance of the inefficient public sector units, where most of the PSUs at that time were suffering losses and had outdated technologies. And still, government continued to fund them. And to solve this problem, government started disinvesting, where government starts selling its part of ownership to the private players or the investors, both internationally and domestically. And the objective was not just to raise the money, but also add or introduce efficiency, accountability, and professionalism through private management, due to which in several sectors like airlines, telecommunication, or banking, private players were allowed to enter the market and breaking the decades of public monopoly. Globalization was the third pillar, which opens the Indian economy to the rest of the world. And before the reforms, India followed an economic policy of the isolation, where the trade barriers were high and imports were restricted, and foreign companies had a limited presence in Indian economy. And globalization reversed this approach. The government eased import restriction, reduced custom duties, and made the Indian rupee partially convertible, allowing easier foreign trade and currency exchange. And government also introduced export-oriented policies to promote Indian goods and services in the global market. And this step of the government encouraged global companies to invest in India and enable Indian companies to compete internationally. And over the time, these measures helped India to become a major player in sector like IT, pharmaceutical, and service sector. And cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad transformed into the global IT hubs as India integrated into the global economy. And together, all of these LPG reforms transform India's economic landscape, where the GDP growth rates, which average around 3 to 4% before 1991, rose to 6 to 8% in the following decades. And forex reserve increased from less than $1 billion in 1991 to over hundreds of billion in later years. And all of these reforms not just only stabilized the Indian economy, but also reshaped India's future. From a near bankrupt nation, India became the fastest growing economy in the world over the next few decades. So today, when you see India as major global economy, it's important to remember that all of this started with the moment of the crisis, the time when India had no choice but to change, the time when India was reborn economically. So I'm going to be ending this story with a quote from Dr. Manmohan Singh, which he spoke in Parliament in 1991, that no power on earth can stop an idea whose time has to come, and the emergence of India as a major economic power is one such idea. So this is the end of the story. Hope you enjoy it. If you find this story insightful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Voice Wallet, because understanding the money is not about the numbers, it's about the stories which shapes the nation. So thank you guys for watching this video till the end. I am Pushpender and I will see you in the next episode. Thank you and bye bye.